It's been over 2 months since Palworld was released, and whilst the hype for the game online may have petered down somewhat, I figured I'd take a look at the game and how it handles on the Steam Deck once again after 2 months worth of bug fixes, performance enhancements, and possible tweaking by Valve with the Proton software. But before we dive into the details, if you want to see more future Palworld videos alongside other gaming content, hit that subscribe button as this channel inches closer to 1000 subscribers. Which video you click subscribe on does have an impact as to which videos I proceed to go forwards with. Now onto the main course of this video, and we'll start by establishing a quick timeline. Palworld released to the world on the 19th of January 2024 into early access, and began putting out patches on a weekly basis, initially to address all of the usual stuff, that being bugs, exploits, performance issues, and so on. Everything you'd expect of an early access title. After 2 weeks had passed, I put out a video recorded on the 6th of February showcasing how Palworld handles on the Steam Deck. If you're curious, I'll leave a link to this video in the description. In that video, I was able to achieve 30 frames per second consistently with the Steam Deck, which, let's be honest, is the target frame rate for many of the 3D games on the Steam Deck itself, given the nature of it being a handheld computer thingy. That 30 frames per second was achieved by having the game run on low settings, with the exception of view distance and texture quality, which saw medium settings. But the gameplay took a hit from playing the game with these settings, most notably the view distance, as I quickly came to the conclusion that view distance needs to be as high as possible in these exploration games, especially when hunting down those Liftmunk effigies, which on low settings can only be seen at a distance at night time. I also found that when entering dungeons, the game was guaranteed to crash on the loading screen unless I reduced the game's resolution down just a notch, which kind of breaks the immersion somewhat, reducing the resolution even further down from 720 or 800, and results in you actively avoiding that particular portion of the game. So moving on to the current version of version 1.5.1 when I was recording this video, I do believe it's gone up since with the impending raid update. I am able to play the game at 30 frames per second with the view distance raised to high and shadows raised to medium. These two improvements alone make the game feel like a totally different experience from a graphical perspective, and whilst exploring I would bump up the view distance up even higher to help with tracking down those Liftmunk effigies. This of course would have to be lowered again back on the ground, where there are over a dozen pals running around and possibly fighting, but it's a massive improvement and really helps with the exploration within this game. You'll notice throughout this video that I play the game in 1280 by 720 and not 1280 by 800. This is just a personal preference for recording purposes, as it keeps the aspect ratios clean for when scaling up for YouTube, and whenever I want the statistics up at the top of the screen for how the game is performing, it doesn't interfere with the actual gameplay itself. So what about those dreaded dungeons? Well, on my first entry, I was running the Decky Recorder software in the background to capture the loading experience, and of course, it crashed. After a minute, I took this photo with my phone and proceeded to reboot the Steam Deck. Yeah. Getting back into the game, I disabled Decky Recorder this time around and loaded into the dungeon successfully, and proceeded to turn it back on again once inside for what turned out to be a seamless experience. The experience once inside was no different to in the overworld from a performance perspective, until I got back into the overworld, whereby my, of course, previous 30 frames per second performance began to just tank completely, struggling to even get to 20 frames per second. Prior to going into this dungeon, I had managed to get a good couple of hours worth of gameplay with 30 frames per second, with it barely dipping at all. So it's safe to say that there were still some issues performance-wise with the dungeons themselves, because it was going into this dungeon that crashed the game, and leaving this dungeon that tanked the frame rate. What I recommend here is that you reboot the game after dungeons to avoid these frame rate drops, as they can be incredibly immersion breaking. Going back to the overworld, I decided to run a quick little stress test as a Mamorist was strolling through my base. I proceeded to attack it and watched about 14 pals as they joined in for what appeared to be a confused mess of a fireworks display. Throughout the 30 seconds it took to take down the Mamorist, the frame rate remained roughly for the most part in the 20s, with the exception of a quick drop to 16. If you expect to find yourself in situations like this frequently, then the graphic settings might need dialing down just a touch further, but for me this works out great, as under these conditions I literally am able to just sit back and enjoy. I don't have to interact with the game whilst this particular scenario is playing out. Now let's talk about battery life. When I first booted up the game with my previously low settings, I had an estimated battery life of around 2 hours, which was lowered to approximately 90 minutes after I'd bumped up the graphic settings, which I found to be an excellent trade-off given the importance of view distance in large open world games such as this. If battery life is of the utmost importance to you, maybe you've got a long plane journey ahead of you and need every minute of gameplay that you can fill your time with, then lowering the settings as far as possible will net you around 3 hours of gameplay. Although note that the game's UI elements become rather difficult to read at the lower resolutions, harming the quality of the gameplay itself. Hopefully this is something the developers might look into for making the UI more usable at lower resolutions, because as it stands at the moment, the lower resolutions just might as well not even be in the game, because the UI is just not usable at those resolutions. So that is where Palworld stands on the Steam Deck at the moment. Not only is the game stable, but you can achieve 30 frames per second 90% of the time with reasonable graphic settings, with the clause of being wary of dungeons as far as performance and stability are concerned. If the developers were to fix these issues behind dungeons, then I would happily settle with the performance that we are currently seeing on the Steam Deck, although I will happily take advantage of any performance boosts we might see in future patches. But anyways, that's just one person's experiences with Palworld on the Steam Deck 2 months on. How has the game performed for you? Let me know in the comments section down below and hit that subscribe button for future content. Until the next video, play casual.